So today's video is for anyone who has always felt that you've had tight hamstrings. And what we're going to touch on in this video is I want to talk to you about why your hamstrings might be tight and then what you need to do to make sure that you give yourself the best chance possible of no longer feeling like you have to have tight hamstrings. Now, this topic came up with a patient of mine the other day where we were talking about a different condition and we were talking about the theme of why muscles become tight in the first place. I'm always of the mindset that there has to be a reason for everything musculoskeletally. If you feel tight, if you feel stiff, if you feel weak, if you're in pain or injured, there's often a tangible cause for that somewhere, but what it does require you to do is to take a step back a little bit more broadly and look at things with a little bit of a different perspective to try and understand why you eventually become sore or dysfunctional in some way. And the concept that's really important to understand about muscle tightness is that it's there for a reason. Muscle tightness isn't just a tightened piece of elastic, it's a request from your brain and nervous system for support, protection, or through misuse or disuse. So if you are someone who has consistently felt like you've always had tight hamstrings and you don't know how to solve it, despite all the best stretches and working really hard on your strength and capacity, it's important to understand that your hamstrings are tight because of something else. Something else is triggering your brain and nervous system to feel the need to tighten those hamstrings, to draw function and slack out of those hamstrings to support or protect something else. And when we're talking about hamstring function, the one thing that I think gets missed so much in regards to hamstring tightness and hamstring flexibility, and to a lesser degree hamstring injuries, is the role of lower back dysfunction on hamstring function. And what I find clinically is if you have some sort of restriction in your lower back, whether it be the muscle tissue, the joints, whether you've got some neural tension in there, or the positions that you put your spine into day to day aren't good enough, your brain and nervous system can ask your hamstrings to tighten to support or protect, or essentially to help out your lower back. So if you are someone who has felt like you've always had tight hamstrings, it's potentially very likely that you may not have had perfect spinal function for the entirety of that feeling. So as always with these type of videos, what's really important to do first is to do a quick assessment of how tight your hamstrings feel, so that as we go through each one of these two exercises and then talk about your postural habits, you'll have something to compare it to straight away to instantly see if this is effective for you in the moment. So there's two really simple ways you can check how tight your hamstrings feel. The first is to stand up and bend forwards, just paying close attention to how far you feel you can go, but also how it feels through your hamstrings to do that movement. The second is a basic sit and reach test. And with the sit and reach test, what we can basically do is if you can have one leg out in front of you and trying to keep your back as straight as you can, we essentially want you to bend forward as far as you feel comfortable. Now, what's really important when you are trying to test your hamstring length is that we don't want you to have your knee straight. Whether you're standing upwards and bending forwards or sitting down and leaning forwards, if you have your knee straight, you might find that you'll feel more tension at the back of your knee. And as we've talked about before, if you feel tension in the back of your knee, you're not actually stretching your hamstring muscle. You're more likely tensioning that sciatic nerve as it passes down through the back of your leg. Anatomically, the tendons of your hamstrings essentially go either side of your knee down towards the top of your calves. And there isn't necessarily any hamstring tissue at the back of that knee. When trying to find pure hamstring tightness, you should be looking to feel it through the muscle of the belly of the muscle in that mid-thigh at the back. So if you can be up nice and tall, have a little bit of a bend in your knee, and just try and close your hip down as far as you feel comfortable until you find some general tightness and general tension at the back of your thigh in the middle. Just be aware that we want to try and make sure that we keep your back straight with this as much as possible, just to get a pure understanding of the quality of how far you can go. Because for me, I can close my hip down to here, I've reached the end of my hamstring tension or length, but if I just bend my back, I can essentially get down as low as I need to without ever necessarily affecting a change in the length of that hamstring tissue. So just to be consistent, try and be up as tall as you can and then just hinge forward as far as you feel comfortable until you feel that general tension through your thigh. And again, we're going to come back to this in a second to see if anything has actually changed. So the first exercise I want to go through here is one that hopefully helps address some of that underlying and potentially hidden lower back dysfunction. Again, we're looking for anything at the base of your back that might be stiff, tight, restricted. It may or may not be tender. You may or may not have an overt feeling of lower back pain or dysfunction at the time, but we're looking for something that shouldn't be there. We're going to try and take that away. And in this case, we're going to use a foam roller, whereas as we like to do on the channel, you can use a ball of some sort. You can do any lower back mobility exercise that you feel resonates with you the most. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to use the foam roller. So what I'd like you to do is if you take your foam roller or other mobility object, place that right at the base of your spine as a starting reference point. Now, there's obviously a few different ways you can do this. You can have your bottom bottom on the ground and you can arch backwards and support your head. But for me, I traditionally like to have my shoulders on the ground. So we want to get you to move the roller to a point where you might find a little bit of tightness. You can roll a little bit to one side and roll a little bit to the other side, just paying attention to which side you feel is the most stiff, tight, and restricted. All we want to get you to do is, once you've found a spot that feels a little bit stiff, tight, and restricted, is I want you to keep some constant pressure on this spot and promote the soft tissue and the joints underneath to eventually give over time. Now, to speed this up, because we're dealing with muscle tissue potentially just as much as stiff joints underneath, once you've found a spot that feels a bit stiff and restricted, if I get you to squeeze your butt, squeeze your back muscles, tense the tissue up underneath that roller. Again, get your brain involved, ask that tissue to tense. The idea being, as always, is that once you stop tensing that tissue, it creates this reflex which should help relax that tissue immediately to some degree. That might feel to you like the roller is sinking in a little bit deeper. It might feel a little bit softer, hopefully. It might be a little bit less tender than it would otherwise be. And again, you can keep tensing that area, giving it a squeeze for 5 seconds, relaxing, letting it go a little bit deeper, giving it a tense for 5 seconds, relaxing, letting it go a little bit deeper. And then you can move the roller up a little bit. And then as you go further sort of up your spine, you can drop your hips down a little bit more to add increased tension to that area. And then if you can keep basically heading further and further up your spine, looking for anything that feels like it's a little bit stiff and tight for you. Again, giving it a squeeze, making everything work for a few seconds, then relaxing. Hunt around for whatever's meaningful to you. And then what you'll hopefully find is that you can come back to that same sit and reach test that we did a second ago, being up nice and tall, having a little bit of a bend in your knee, trying to hinge forward from your hips. Hopefully I'll put up a comparison, but to me, this feels like I'm going further before I feel like that hamstring becomes a little bit tight. I don't necessarily feel like I'm bending my back any more than what I was before. Again, I can still get all the way down if I need to, but the purpose of this exercise is that by taking away some of that potentially hidden, restricted, dysfunctional tissue in your spine, you can start to give permission back to those hamstrings to normalize. So the next thing that we need to get to in your quest to permanently reduce your hamstring tightness forever is we need to give you an effective strategy to loosen up those hamstrings. And again, there's so many different types of hamstring stretches, so I would ultimately get you to choose the one that you feel works best for you, but ultimately it has to make you feel different straight away for it to be worth your time. And for me, a really simple way that I like to stretch a tight hamstring is to essentially pop your foot up onto something and do your traditional bending forwards. But again, the key to any good hamstring stretch is we don't want your knee to be straight, because again, if we do and you feel that tension at the back of your knee, then you are most likely tensioning the sciatic nerve and not stretching that hamstring tissue, which defeats the purpose of this exercise. But for the purpose of a good hamstring stretch, again, you can start with your legs straight, but then bend your knee a little bit from that position. And as always, we want you to close down your hip first as far as you feel comfortable, not just blindly bend forwards in the hope that you find the best hamstring stretch possible. So again, what I'd like you to do is being up nice and tall with a bend in your knee. Imagine you've got a hinge through your hip. Close your hip down as far as you can until you feel like you get some tightness at the back of your thigh. What I'll then get you to do is we need to tense this muscular tightness in order to immediately prompt it to release so that you can go further into the stretch straight away. So once again, give it a squeeze. If you need to push your heel down into the chair or the bed, you need to. If you need to, imagine that you're bending your knee a little bit, almost trying to pull your heel back towards you. It doesn't matter how you tension up that tightness. We just need some tension there for 5 to 10 seconds so that again, when you stop tensing it, you might find you can go a little bit deeper. You can squeeze that tissue again, hold it for 5 to 10 seconds, release, and then you might find you can drop down a little bit deeper again. That gave a fair bit for me. I'm going to squeeze that tissue again, just for a good 5 to 10 seconds, then relax, and again, that hip closes down a little bit further. And we want to keep doing this until you either get sick of the stretch or you stop making change. But the secret to doing this exercise is that you need to see an immediate improvement in your hamstring flexibility, otherwise you haven't done anything. And coupled with your lower back mobility exercise of choice, you should feel like over time that hamstring stops wanting to be tight consistently. And so this brings us to the third point that I raised at the top of the video, is that once you've improved your lower back mobility, improved your hamstring flexibility, we also need to take care of one of the reasons why your lower back may be stiff in the first place, and maybe asking those hamstrings to also be dysfunctional over time. And again, based solely on what I find clinically with my patients, if you are someone who has jumped on a ball or a foam roller, and you found a certain section of your lower back does in fact feel a little bit tight, a little bit stiff, and a little bit restricted, and by releasing some of that restriction, you feel like your hamstring flexibility improves straight away, then there has to be a reason why that part of your back has become stiff, potentially on one side more than the other. And again, one of the concepts that I try so hard to promote on this channel is that generally if you take a look at the things that you do most throughout your day, not necessarily the active, interesting things, but more specifically the less active, the more sedentary type things like sitting, and you were to rank those things from what you spend the most time doing throughout the day to the least time doing throughout the day, then it makes a lot of logical sense to start paying attention to the shapes and the postures that you're in the most throughout the day for clues as to how you might be loading up those parts of your back that you've uncovered, so that you can ultimately change those shapes, improve how you're loading your back, and give permission for those hamstrings to stay loose long term. So what I would urge you to do, if you're trying to get rid of those tight hamstrings, you've got to pay close attention most likely to how you're positioning your lower back when you do the things that you do most throughout the day. If you work and you sit at a desk, if you're someone who sits at a computer, even if you work hard all day and then end up sitting on the couch at home to relax, or you're somebody who drives long distances, the shape that you put your spine into really determines where the load goes in that spine. So if you're someone who tends to sit down and instead of being sort of bolt upright, you find that you do start to sort of sink and maybe slouch a little bit through that lower back, then wherever the hinge goes is where the load goes clinically. And if you've never noticed that you're putting a bit of a hinge into your back, or you have noticed but it's never been meaningful enough for you to care, then hopefully if you can see that some improved hamstring function may require your back to function better, and the reason why your back may not be functioning perfectly is because without you even realizing it, there might be a lot more time spent in less than ideal shapes and postures than you may have realized, then we need to pay attention if we want this to change over time. So what I would recommend that you do is if you can stand up into a really comfortable position, you stand in front of your chair or the seat that you would normally sit into most throughout the day, and you stand up comfortably tall, squeeze your bottom to put your pelvis in a good position, draw your belly in just to hold that position really well. In a perfect world, because it's the same spine that you use to stand and it's the same spine that you use to sit, in theory nothing should really change just because your hips and knees have bent. But the way that the modern world is currently structured, because we value sitting so much, it's really easy for our environment to suck us out of this position and distract us from that fact for the entire time that we're there. So if you're not taking a moment to pay attention to where the load's going into your back and how you can try and take the load out of your back with like a lumbar roll or a rolled up towel or a thick cylindrical cushion to prompt a better shape, then it might be hard for your back to stay loose and free, and it might be hard for your hamstrings to stay loose and free without having to do some maintenance week to week. So once again, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Please let me know in the comments down below if it was, but I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.